Why aren't they looking at us? The question, whispered in panic, hung in the sweltering Texas air. The train screeched to a stop under the intense sun, the air shimmering with heat, dust, and raw fear. Dozens of women in worn grey uniforms stepped onto the platform, clutching small satchels, their eyes darting toward the American soldiers waiting nearby. They had crossed an ocean, survived bombings, and now stood in a land they had been taught to dread more than death itself. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as savages, men who would humiliate, violate, and destroy any German woman who fell into their hands. In leaflets and radio broadcasts, the warnings were clear: better to die than be captured by the Americans. And so, as the train doors opened, the women braced themselves for what they believed was coming. Elsa Schmidt, a 28-year-old from Hamburg, could feel her heart pounding in her throat. She had memorized every escape plan, every desperate thought of resistance. But when the soldiers stepped forward, something unexpected happened. They didn't shout, they didn't leer, they didn't even touch them. "Please, this way, ma'am," said one of the guards in a calm voice. The words struck her like a slap. Ma'am, a term of respect spoken to a prisoner. The women exchanged confused glances. Instead of rough hands and barking orders, they were guided gently toward waiting trucks. One soldier offered water. Another adjusted the canvas to give them shade. It was not kindness they expected, but it was kindness they received. Elsa whispered the desperate question to the woman beside her. "Why aren't they looking at us?" No one answered. The silence was heavier than any threat. As the convoy rolled through the Texas countryside, the women saw endless stretches of open land, ranches, windmills, blue sky without smoke. They passed by farmers waving from fields, children running alongside the road, and for a brief moment, the war felt far away, but the fear wouldn't fade easily. Inside the trucks, whispers filled the air. "They're pretending," one muttered. "It's all a trick." Another clutched a locket and prayed in German under her breath. When they arrived at the camp gates, they saw a sign painted with bold white letters, United States Army POW, Camp. The barbed wire glinted in the sun. Guards stood watch, rifles at rest, not aimed, and behind the fences, rows of barracks, vegetable gardens, and even a small chapel. An American officer approached, removing his cap. "Ladies," he said, "you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You have nothing to fear here." Elsa felt her knees weaken. Nothing to fear. It was the first time she had heard those words from a man in uniform. As they were processed, the guards stepped back, giving them space. No one touched them. No one mocked them. Even when a woman dropped her papers, a soldier bent to pick them up and handed them back without a word. The decency was unbearable. They had prepared themselves for brutality, not for grace. That night in the barracks, Elsa sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the Texas plains. She could still hear her mother's voice warning her before she left Germany. "Don't let them see you cry." But now the tears came without permission. She whispered into the darkness. "They didn't even touch us." Another woman sitting beside her nodded slowly. "Maybe that's what scares me most." In that moment, something began to shift. A crack forming in years of lies, opening a quiet path toward truth. Elsa didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning of a story that would shatter everything she thought she knew about enemies, honor, and what it meant to be human. Before Texas, they had been fed stories of horror. In every town square, every cinema, every classroom in Germany, the message was the same. The Americans were not men, they were monsters. The propaganda films showed darkened figures laughing over burning villages. Radio broadcasts warned that captured women would be used, broken, erased. Mothers whispered the same warnings to daughters, and teachers repeated it to girls too young to understand war. Better to die than be taken. For Elsa Schmidt, those warnings were carved into memory. She still remembered the newsreel she'd watched in 1943, an American soldier depicted as a giant crushing German women under his boots. The theater audience hissed, spat, and swore vengeance. Elsa had believed it too. Every German did. Now in Texas, the myth began to crumble, one small gesture at a time. When the guards led them through the camp, no one jeered, no one stared. Each soldier looked straight ahead, careful, almost distant. It was the kind of discipline born not from fear, but from principle. At registration, an American clerk spoke through an interpreter, explaining camp rules clearly. You will be treated as military personnel. You will work. You will have food, clothing, and medical care. A German woman interrupted in disbelief. Medical care for prisoners? The interpreter nodded. Yes, if you are sick, the nurse will see you. It sounded absurd. In Germany, civilians had gone without medicine for months. The hospitals were rubble, the wounded were left to rot. But here, the enemy offered them a doctor. The next morning, US Army nurses examined the new arrivals. They wore clean white uniforms, spoke softly, and never once used the word enemy. When one of the women winced as her bandages were removed, the nurse stopped immediately. You tell me if it hurts, she said, her voice gentle, firm, and patient. Elsa's heart clenched. This woman was helping her. This woman, who might have lost a brother to German bombs, was still helping her. Later that day, a group of POWs was escorted to the showers. When the guards ordered them to bathe, panic rippled through the line. They had heard the rumors, the showers in the camps back in Europe. Several women froze, trembling. The guards didn't move closer. They turned their backs, giving them space. One said quietly, "You're safe here. It's just water." When the first drops fell, warm and real, the tension broke. The women washed in silence, some laughing, others crying. For the first time in years, they felt clean without fear. That night, Elsa couldn't sleep. She lay awake, trying to reconcile the two worlds in her mind, the one she had been told to fear and the one she was living in now. At dawn, she walked outside the barracks, the dry Texas wind catching her hair. A young soldier stood guard by the gate, his rifle slung casually, his posture relaxed. He nodded politely as she passed. That simple gesture, a nod, nothing more shattered the last fragments of the myth. She realized that the enemy she had imagined did not exist. Instead, there were men here, young, sunburned, homesick, who obeyed rules, not because of cruelty, but because of conscience. War had told her that Americans were beasts, but in their restraint, she saw something terrifyingly powerful, mercy. And mercy, she thought, might be the strongest weapon of all. The convoy stopped outside a wide fenced compound, surrounded by open prairie. The sign on the gate read simply, Camp Hereford, US Army, prisoner of war facility. To the German women, it looked less like a prison and more like a small, self-contained town. Rows of barracks stretched into the horizon, flanked by vegetable gardens and laundry lines flapping in the wind. As they climbed out of the trucks, Elsa Schmidt noticed how quiet it was. No shouting guards, no snarling dogs, just the creak of wooden gates and the hum of distant cicadas. The camp commandant, a middle-aged officer with graying hair, stepped forward. His accent marked him as a northerner. "You are prisoners of the United States Army," he said clearly. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed. You will work. You will be fed. You will be respected as soldiers." The women stood in stunned silence. Soldiers. He had called them soldiers. Back home, the Reich had barely called them human. When they were led into the main barracks, they saw clean bunks lined with folded blankets, soap, and even toothbrushes. Each bed had a pillow, something many hadn't seen since the war began. One woman whispered, "This can't be real." At mealtime, they entered the mess hall. The smell of bread and coffee filled the air. They waited for the shouting, for the humiliation, for the slap or the kick that was always part of military life, but it never came. The American cook behind the counter smiled. "Don't be shy, ladies. Eat up." Plates were filled with beans, cornbread, and meat stew. The food was simple, but to the POWs it felt like a feast. Some couldn't eat at first, too overwhelmed to move their spoons. Others cried quietly. That night, one of the camp guards approached Elsa's barracks with a small lantern. His name was Sergeant Collins, a Texan rancher before the war. He spoke softly through the doorway. "If any of y'all need anything, tell the guard post. You're safe here." Safe? The word echoed in her mind like a hymn. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of the camp settled into something almost human. The guards enforced rules strictly, but never cruelly. There was order without fear, punishment without hatred. Some of the women began to volunteer for work duty, tending gardens, cleaning barracks, even helping in the infirmary. They were allowed to write letters, read newspapers, and listen to American radio under supervision. Each new act of normalcy chipped away at years of indoctrination. One afternoon, Elsa was assigned to help clean the camp's small chapel. As she dusted the pews, she noticed something strange. A Bible left open on the altar. The verse was marked in pencil, "Love your enemies." She stared at the words for a long time. It wasn't a command she could understand yet, but she could feel its weight. Outside, she saw Sergeant Collins helping a fellow guard fix a broken fence. They laughed as they worked. Two men who a year earlier might have been aiming rifles at her. She realized then that America's power didn't come from its guns or its bombs. It came from something quieter, a belief that even an enemy deserved dignity. That night, as the Texas wind whispered through the camp, Elsa wrote in her journal, "They do not hate us, and that frightens me more than hate ever could." The first time Elsa Schmidt truly looked into the eyes of an American soldier, she saw something she never expected. Weariness, not the cruelty of a conqueror, but the fatigue of someone who had seen too much of war. His name was Corporal James Miller, a 4-year-old from Oklahoma who guarded the perimeter near her barracks. Every morning he stood watch as the POWs lined up for roll call. He never shouted. He never hurried them. He simply stood there, his rifle resting loosely in his hands, his posture easy but alert. One morning, as Elsa dropped her canteen, he bent down and picked it up before she could react. He handed it back without meeting her eyes and said quietly, "Careful, ma'am." The word echoed in her chest. Ma'am, not prisoner, not enemy, ma'am. That afternoon, while on kitchen duty, Elsa saw Miller again. He was talking with the camp cook, a middle-aged man who was stirring a pot of beans. They were laughing about something, a story, a joke, and Elsa caught the rhythm of it, even if she didn't understand the words. There was no anger in their voices, no tension. Later, Miller noticed her watching and nodded politely. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't pity. It was acknowledgement, the kind a farmer gives another worker at the end of a long day. That night, Elsa couldn't sleep. She thought of the men back home, the Nazi officers, the air raid wardens, the party loyalists. They never looked at her as Miller did. They looked through her. She had been invisible in her own country, but here, the enemy saw her. A week later, she was assigned to help in the medical hut. A few American nurses worked there, tending both guards and prisoners. When Elsa entered, she froze. The sight of the Red Cross flag made her breath catch. She had seen that symbol before in bombed cities, on the arms of people who risked their lives to help. One of the nurses, a woman named Helen, smiled and motioned her over. "You can help clean instruments," she said, speaking slowly so Elsa could understand. As Elsa worked, Helen began humming softly, a tune Elsa didn't recognize. After a while, Helen asked, "Do you have children?" Elsa hesitated. "No," she said. "You?" Helen shook her head. "Not yet. My husband's still overseas." The two women exchanged a long, quiet look. In that moment, there were no uniforms, no borders, no ideologies, just two women waiting for the war to end. That evening, when Elsa returned to the barracks, she wrote in her journal, "The Americans smile too easily. It makes me suspicious. Yet I cannot hate them. Perhaps that is their most dangerous weapon." Days passed. The camp began to feel less like a prison and more like a strange, self-contained town. The women worked in the fields, sewed clothes, even played volleyball on weekends. One evening, Miller approached the barracks with a box in his hands. "The commissary sent these for y'all," he said simply, handing it to the interpreter. Inside were chocolate bars and fruit. The women gasped. Chocolate, a luxury they hadn't seen since before the war. One of them asked the interpreter why the guards would share such things. The interpreter just shrugged. "They say it's what they'd want if the tables were turned." Elsa took a piece of chocolate and broke it in half, offering it to another woman. For the first time, she whispered, "I don't know if I want to go home." That night, as she lay in bed, the Texas wind blowing softly through the window, she realized what was truly breaking her. Not the bars, not the fences, but the unbearable kindness of those she had been taught to despise. The change came slowly, like the Texas sunrise. No speeches, no grand moment, just quiet gestures that began to erode everything the women thought they knew about war. It started the morning the trucks came. A group of POWs, including Elsa Schmidt, were sent to a nearby ranch to help harvest vegetables and mend fences. The guards who accompanied them carried rifles, but loosely, as if they were afterthoughts. The rancher, a leathery man named Tom Whitaker, waved from his porch and called out, "Don't just stand there, girls. Sun's wasting." The German women froze. His tone wasn't cruel, but it was so casual it stunned them. No orders, no barking, just a man talking to workers. Elsa followed his lead into the field, the red soil warm under her feet. The work was simple, repetitive, honest. After hours of bending and pulling, she straightened her back and saw Tom approaching with a bucket of water and a stack of tin cups. "You're doing fine," he said. "Take 5. He poured her a drink himself. She hesitated, unsure whether to accept it. Tom noticed her confusion. "You think I'd poison you?" he asked, half smiling. "Lady, I barely got sugar for my coffee. I ain't wasting it on murder." Elsa laughed. Really laughed. For the first time since the war began. The sound startled her. When the day ended, Tom handed out sandwiches. Real bread, thick slices of ham, mustard, even pickles. The women stared at the food as if it were gold. One whispered, "They're feeding us like friends." Another muttered, "Maybe they pity us." Elsa shook her head. "No. Pity looks down. This feels equal." The next morning, something remarkable happened. One of the guards, Corporal Miller, was helping fix a fence post when it snapped, cutting his hand open. Elsa instinctively ran to help. She tore a strip from her sleeve and wrapped his wound before he could protest. The guard froze, unsure what to say. Then he smiled awkwardly. "Guess you're not all bad either," he said. It was a small thing, but the others saw it. And in that moment, something fragile and human passed between them. Days turned into weeks, and fear faded into routine. The guards began to trust the POWs enough to let them walk unescorted around the ranch. Some even shared cigarettes. One afternoon, a Texan soldier showed a group of women how to ride a horse. The laughter that followed sounded nothing like captivity. But the real turning point came one evening as the sun dipped below the mesquite trees. The ranch cook set up a grill and began cooking dinner. Thick slabs of beef, onions sizzling in butter, the smell drifting through the camp. The German women stood nearby, stunned by the aroma. They had eaten thin soup and stale bread for years. Now the enemy was roasting meat in front of them. When the meal was served, no one moved. Elsa looked at the plate in her hands. Real food cooked with care. Her throat tightened. She took a single bite, then covered her face as tears came unbidden. She wasn't crying from hunger. She was crying because kindness had stripped her bare. Later, as night fell, she wrote in her journal, "I thought dignity came from victory, but here, in defeat, I have found it again in the way they let us eat beside them, work beside them, live beside them. The enemy treats us like equals, and I do not know how to bear it." From that day on, the barbed wire no longer looked like a cage. It looked like a boundary that only existed in the mind. That night, Elsa Schmidt couldn't sleep. The scent of roasted meat still hung faintly in the barracks. But it wasn't hunger that kept her awake. It was confusion. She had been raised to believe that Americans were monsters, that defeat meant humiliation, that mercy was weakness. Yet the more she saw of her captors, the more those beliefs crumbled like ash. The next morning she sat on her bunk, while the others prepared for roll call. Across the room, one of the older women, Greta, muttered, "They're soft. That's why they'll fall one day." Elsa looked up sharply. "Are they?" she asked quietly. "Soft men don't feed their enemies when they could starve them." Greta frowned but said nothing. Later that day, Elsa was sent to help clean the administrative office. On the wall was a newspaper clipping with bold black letters, U.S. POW program, $1.8 billion for housing Axis prisoners humanely. She stared at the number, $1.8 billion. The U.S. was spending that much money to care for its enemies. Her mind flashed to Germany. Bombed cities, civilians queuing for bread, soldiers eating watered-down soup. Even the Wehrmacht didn't feed its own this well. The math hit her harder than any bullet. That afternoon during a break, she asked Corporal Miller, "Why do you treat us this way? We are enemies." He shrugged. "We're Texans. Your people. War don't change that." Elsa tried to reply, but her throat closed. It was such a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of everything she couldn't explain. Later that evening, as the sun painted the sky crimson, she sat outside the barracks, writing in her notebook. The words came slowly, haltingly. We were taught that mercy was a weakness, but mercy requires strength, the kind we never had. Around her, the camp was peaceful. Guards smoked by the fence, laughing quietly. A few of the women hung laundry under the warm light. Somewhere a harmonica played a lonely tune. Elsa thought of the Reich's propaganda reels, stern-faced officers, flags waving, speeches promising triumph. They had painted victory as a monument of steel and blood. But here on American soil, victory looked like something else entirely. It looked like decency. A week later, the camp's chaplain, a gentle man with kind eyes, offered to let the women attend a Sunday service. Elsa went more out of curiosity than faith. The small chapel smelled of dust and wood polish. The chaplain read from the Gospel of Matthew. "Love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you." Elsa froze. Those were the same words she had read weeks earlier in the empty chapel. She hadn't understood them then. Now she did. After the service, the chaplain shook her hand and said, "Peace starts somewhere. Might as well start here." That night she returned to her bunk and wrote again. "They defeated us without a single insult. Just food, just fairness, just the unbearable grace of men who could hate, but don't." She realized then that Germany's downfall wasn't just military. It was moral. The empire built on fear had collapsed, not because its enemies were stronger, but because they were better. The next morning, as she stood for roll call under the blazing Texas sun, Elsa raised her head and met the eyes of the American officer. For the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt like a witness to a truth she could never have imagined. In that silent moment, surrounded by barbed wire and endless sky, she whispered to herself, "They won with kindness, and I am undone." The Red Cross truck arrived at Camp Hereford once a month, carrying mail both ways. Letters from Germany to the prisoners, and letters from the prisoners back home. The guards would line up the German women, check their envelopes for hidden messages, and hand out thin sheets of Red Cross stationery, stamped "Examined" by U.S. Army. For many of the women, these letters were their only link to the world they had left behind. Elsa Schmidt sat at the small wooden desk in the recreation hut, pen trembling in her hand. She had started a dozen letters before this one, each time stopping halfway, unsure of what she was even allowed to say or what she dared to admit. But today, something inside her refused to write lies anymore. She began slowly in neat German script, "My dearest mother, you will not believe what I must tell you." She paused. The words felt too strange, almost dangerous, but she continued anyway. "The Americans treat us well, better than our own officers did. We are given food, real food, bread, meat, even coffee. The guards are polite. They call us ladies. One of them taught me to ride a horse." Her pen stopped again. She could almost see her mother's face reading that line, disbelief, turning to confusion, then something else, hope, maybe. Elsa took a deep breath and kept writing. "I do not know how to explain it. We came here as enemies, but they do not hate us. They laugh. They share cigarettes. They let us work. We are prisoners, yes, but not slaves. They follow rules here. They believe in rules." Across the hut, another woman, Greta, looked up from her own letter. "You're wasting your words," she said softly. "The censors will cut all that out." Elsa shook her head. "Let them read it. Maybe they need to know too." Greta frowned but didn't argue. She turned back to her page. When Elsa finished, she signed the letter carefully. "Your daughter, Elsa, alive and learning that mercy is not weakness." 2 weeks later, that letter arrived in a small town outside Hamburg. Elsa's mother, frail and half-starved, read it aloud to the neighbors. They listened in silence. The idea that Americans, those who had bombed their cities, could treat prisoners with kindness was almost impossible to believe. And yet, The words were written in Elsa's familiar hand. Soon, copies of those letters began circulating quietly among civilians. Someone recopied them by hand and passed them along to a friend who shared them with a cousin in Berlin. Others were read aloud in church basements, in half-ruined homes, in shelters under the rubble of cities. "The Americans feed our soldiers," one letter said. "They follow the law. They do not kill prisoners. They are not monsters." For a people fed only lies, these letters were a revelation. In Camp Hereford, the women never knew how far their words traveled. They only saw the change in the guards' eyes when the next batch of mail arrived, letters from Germany, addressed to "My dearest daughter," now filled with cautious gratitude. Elsa received one of her own. Her mother had written, "If what you say is true, perhaps there is hope after all." That night Elsa read the letter again under the dim glow of the barracks lamp. Her hands trembled as she whispered, "Yes, Mama, there is hope," and it came from the enemy. In the quiet, she realized something profound. She hadn't written propaganda, she had written truth. And in a world built on lies, truth was the most dangerous weapon of all. The letters from Texas were never printed in newspapers, never read aloud on German radio, but they spread nonetheless across oceans, across borders, across the iron curtain of hate that the war had built. Long after the fighting ended, people would remember those whispers from America, that even in captivity, the enemy had shown them what humanity really meant. The spring of 1945 came early to Texas. The mesquite trees bloomed, and the prairie grass swayed in soft waves beyond the barbed wire. For the German women, the days had settled into a rhythm. Work, meals, letters, the slow turning of the war's final chapters heard through the camp radio. But for Elsa Schmidt, something felt unfinished. It was late afternoon when the dust cloud appeared on the road outside the fence. A pickup truck rolled to a stop near the gate. The driver wore a wide-brimmed hat and boots caked in red soil. Elsa recognized him instantly. The cowboy from the ranch, Tom Whitaker. He had been the first American to speak to her like a person, the one who poured her water, who laughed without cruelty. She hadn't seen him since the harvest months ago. Now he climbed out of his truck, carrying a small crate wrapped in burlap. The guards recognized him too. They waved him through the gate after a brief word. He nodded to them, then looked toward the barracks where the women were finishing their day's work. Elsa hesitated, then stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came back," she said softly, her accent heavy. Tom smiled. "Told you I would. Can't let good workers vanish without saying thank you." He set the crate down at her feet. "Here, brought something from the ranch. Inside were jars, homemade preserves, peaches sealed in thick syrup. The color glowed golden in the afternoon light." Elsa blinked, unsure how to react. "For us?" Tom shrugged. "Figured you might like a taste of home. Well, Texas is home anyway." The women gathered around, murmuring in disbelief. No one spoke for a moment. Then one of them, Greta, whispered, "Why? We are your prisoners." Tom looked at her calmly. "War is nearly over," he said. "Ain't no sense in carrying hate longer than the fight." He turned to Elsa. "You'll be going home soon, I reckon. Remember this place. Tell them how it really was." "They will not believe me," she said quietly. "They will say it is American propaganda." Tom smiled faintly. "Then let them think what they want. Truth don't need believers. It just waits." There was silence between them, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Then, without thinking, Elsa extended her hand. Tom hesitated only a second before shaking it. His grip was firm, steady, warm. It was the first time she had willingly touched an American. For a moment the camp seemed to disappear, the guards, the fences, the war. There was only the handshake, rough, calloused fingers, meeting the trembling hand of a woman who had spent years taught to hate him. The other women watched, stunned. They saw something shift in that instant, not just between Elsa and the cowboy, but in all of them. The line between enemy and friend, between pride and peace, blurred beyond recognition. Tom tipped his hat, turned, and climbed back into his truck. "Take care, Miss Schmidt," he called. "And don't forget, barbecue tastes better with peach jam." As the truck rumbled away, Elsa stood motionless, clutching the jar of preserves to her chest. That night, she gathered the women in the mess hall. Together, they opened the jars and shared spoonfuls of the sweet fruit. No one spoke at first. Then, one by one, they began to laugh softly, freely, like people who remembered what it felt like to live. When the last jar was empty, Elsa whispered. He said, "Truth waits. I think he is right. It will wait for us to carry it home." The camp was quiet as the lights went out, but in that silence, something larger than war had taken root. A small, defiant seed of humanity, planted in the middle of Texas by a cowboy with a jar of peaches. When the war finally ended, the announcement came not with trumpets, but through the crackle of the camp radio. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally," the American broadcaster said. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Some of the German women began to cry quietly. Others sat in stunned silence. For Elsa Schmidt, there was no relief, only an ache that reached too deep for tears. She had dreamed for years that peace would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like a confession. The guards didn't cheer. They didn't mock or celebrate. They simply stood by, somber and respectful, as the prisoners tried to understand what defeat really meant. That night, the camp mess hall was quieter than usual. The women ate in silence until Sergeant Collins entered carrying a large pot. Cook said, "There's extra tonight." He said, "War's over. Might as well eat like free folks." He served them generous helpings of stew and bread, and no one could bring themselves to refuse. Elsa took a bite and realized it was the same meal she'd eaten the day she arrived. Simple, warm, human. When she looked up, Collins was watching her. He smiled. "You made it," he said softly. Later, when the camp lights dimmed, Elsa sat by her bunk and opened her journal for the last time. The words came easily now. They called them cowboys. We called them fools. But it turns out the fools were us. We believed fear was power. They believed kindness was, and kindness won. In the days that followed, American officers began preparing the POWs for repatriation. They were given clean uniforms, medical checkups, and Red Cross packages for the journey home. Elsa helped distribute supplies, moving from barrack to barrack with a quiet sense of purpose. One afternoon, as she packed her things, she found the jar of peaches Tom Whitaker had brought. Only a little syrup remained at the bottom. She smiled, then placed it carefully in her satchel. It wasn't a souvenir. It was proof. The day they left, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks for the long trip to the coast. The Americans stood by the gate as they departed. Some waved, others simply nodded. When Elsa's truck passed the main gate, she saw Corporal Miller standing near the fence line. He raised his hand in farewell. She did the same. Neither said a word. But in that silent exchange, something eternal passed between them, a recognition that war could not erase what decency had built. Back in Germany, Elsa's words would become quiet legends. Her letters and journal entries were read in church basements and whispered among neighbors who still flinched at the sound of Allied planes. "The Americans fed us," one woman said. "They called us human again." Years later, when peace had long returned and the camps were nothing but grass in memory, Elsa visited Texas once more. She found the site where Camp Hereford had stood, a field of wild flowers where barbed wire had once cut the wind. A young rancher met her there, the grandson of Tom Whitaker. "You came all this way?" he asked, tipping his hat. Elsa smiled faintly. "I promised someone I would." She handed him the empty jar she had carried across the ocean. "Your grandfather once gave me this. It was the first taste of forgiveness I ever knew." The young man looked at it for a long moment, then said softly, "He'd be glad you came back." Elsa turned to the horizon, where the Texas sky burned gold and endless. "He taught me something no one in uniform ever did," she said. "That victory isn't who wins the war, it's who keeps their soul after it." For a long time, neither spoke. Then the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of mesquite and dust. Elsa closed her eyes and whispered, "The enemy became my teacher." And somewhere deep in her heart, she knew the war had finally ended. Not on a battlefield, but here in this quiet place where mercy had once conquered pride. The story of Camp Hereford was never printed in headlines or carved into monuments. It lived instead in memories, in letters carried across oceans, in the quiet dignity of people who discovered that mercy could be stronger than hate. When historians later studied the U.S. POW program, they found the math almost unbelievable. The United States spent more to feed, house, and educate its enemies than Germany spent on its own citizens during the final years of the war. To some, it looked like excess, but to others, it was proof that compassion was not weakness. It was civilization itself. Elsa Schmidt's name would fade from the records, but her words would outlast her. They defeated us without cruelty. They conquered us with decency. As the sun set over the empty fields of Texas, the ghosts of that camp, the guards, the prisoners, the cowboys seemed to whisper the same truth. Power destroys, kindness endures. History remembers wars by their battles, but peace, the kind that lasts, is remembered by how the victors treated the defeated. And sometimes victory isn't written in blood or glory. It's written in the shared act of a meal, a handshake, and the simple decision to be human.